brought to you courtesy of the red, white, and blue. I am a real American, fight for the rights of every man. American woman, mama, let me be free. Born in the USA.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm coming at you, recorded from the Underground AP compound here in sunny, scenic Lincourt, New York. And today we are going to talk about World War II, battles, conferences, alliances, all kinds of military stuff, a lot of foreign policy. So for those of you bagpipe noting at home, you want to think about A, America in the world. That's our theme for today. And right now we've got a primary source playing for you. This is the Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy from Company B. Alexa, stop. So again, today we're going to talk about military history. We're going to talk about World War II, tell a couple funny stories. We will do a separate lecture just on the home front. And let's go to the big board. All right, stuff you should always remember. Now, when I used to help kids with the Global Studies Regents and we talked about World War II, I always taught them, ta-da, T-A-D-A. Going into the war, think about totalitarian dictatorships. We're fighting against totalitarian dictators like Il Duce, Mussolini, Adolf Hitler. But we're also going to end up working with a totalitarian dictator, Joseph Stalin, whom FDR once said, this guy is reasonable, we can work with him. A, Axis. Remember, that's the bad guys we're talking about this time around. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. D, dictatorships. Again, yes, I know I'm redundant, but you come up with acronyms. And the last A, appeasement, which of course we remember came from that's right, the Munich Pact. Okay, so now that we've got the stage of who we're fighting, remember, World War II starts on September 1st, 1939, when the USSR and Germany, just prior to, signed what's called the Non-Aggression Pact, and both decide, yep, we'll gobble up Poland. And the new style of warfare they fight, do you remember what that's called? The lightning warfare? That's right, blitzkrieg, or the blitz that we think of.
Son, I gotta do better than this.
Germans use this idea of mobile, fast attacks. Alright, now, the war has started in Europe, and we talked last time about how the United States tried to maintain its policy of neutrality. But we were building up and preparing for the war. I shared the story about my wife's grandfather, who was drafted in 1940 under the Selective Service Act. We talked about things like the cash and carry from the 1939 Neutrality Acts, destroyer for bases deal. In 1940, Franklin Roosevelt said, you know, I'm not planning on running for re-election, but if the American people really want me. Well, in 1940, the Democratic Party nominated FDR to a third term. And FDR won his election. He defeated Republican Wendell Willkie. It wasn't in the type of landslide that we saw in earlier elections. And yeah, you know, FDR was breaking that George Washington precedent of only serving two terms. But he had two big things in his favor. One, the economy had grown stronger, mainly because of that wartime production. Think about things like the Lend-Lease Act. But also, throughout American history, one thing we've seen is in a time of crisis, in a time of war, or in a time when people are scared, we tend not to want to change leaders. And yes, we were not technically involved in World War II. However, it had already started in Europe. So we know one thing, the American people felt more comfortable with the same leader, even if it meant he was breaking a precedent established by President Washington. We know that can't happen today because after FDR's administration, in 1951, the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, which said you can only serve two terms. But that was after FDR, after he was actually elected to his fourth term. He wouldn't make it through that fourth term. 82 days into his fourth term, FDR died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Now, leading up to Pearl Harbor. Again, kids tend to think, oh, Pearl Harbor, that was it, and the United States got involved and everybody was on the same page. Remember, never use everybody or always in an essay. Because just statistically speaking, you're going to be wrong. In this case, very wrong. So on December 7th, 1941.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, that became the trigger for us to officially enter the war.
Nothing is over until we decide it is. Was it over when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor? Hell no!
Germans? Forget it, he's rolling.
The next day, in the United States Congress, we declared war. One member of Congress, however, voted against that, and that was Congresswoman Jeannette Rankin. She was the sole person to vote against this declaration of war. Now, why is she relevant? Jeannette Rankin, if you remember, when we talked about the Progressive Era, she was the first woman to serve in Congress. In fact, when we declared war against Germany for World War I, she was one of 50 people who voted against that declaration. This time, she's the one. You know, agree or not with her point of view, you have to admit it took courage for her to do that. When we talk about World War II, you know, we're talking about a war where we're fighting against racism, where we're fighting against discrimination and prejudice, but we have to acknowledge the fact that in the United States, we were not clean, we were not innocent. And you see that kind of paradox with the fact that some of the most valiant soldiers we had were people who were being denied their rights. African Americans fought in segregated units, lived in segregated barracks, and since many military camps were in the South, they had to experience Jim Crow segregation while getting ready to serve our country. African Americans were less likely to be officers. The most famous group of African Americans to serve in the war were the Tuskegee Airmen. Think back about that name, reference Booker T. Washington. The Tuskegee Airmen were an all African American pilot group, and they actually flew as escorts to protect First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt during the war. But it's not just African Americans. We're talking about Native Americans. One of the best weapons we had during World War II was our ability to protect our codes while cracking the codes of our enemies. And we had an unbreakable way to communicate in some instances. The Navajo language is not written. So we hired Navajo Native Americans to be what were called code talkers. And when they would describe a tank, it might be a giant turtle or something like that. And basically, it made it so that when they were speaking, there was no way that the enemy could decode what they were saying. And even though technically speaking, you don't see any women here in my very historically accurate diorama, we have to remember that both men and women served our country. If you were a woman, you could be a nurse in the Army. You could also be what was called a WAC, a Women's Army Auxiliary Corps member. There are a lot of jobs in the military that don't always involve picking up a gun. You need clerks. You need people to run the show. You need people in offices. And the idea of the WAC program was that every time you put a woman in one of these jobs, you were putting a rifle in the hands of another man. On the home front, women could be what we called WOWs, Women's Ordnance Workers. And of course, we know the most famous one could flex. Other important things to know about World War II. This is what we call a two-theater war. And that's why I've got our Army guys I stole from my 6-year-old out here. Here's the problem we have with World War II. We have to fight Germany in Europe, in the Atlantic Ocean. We have to fight Japan as they try to control a gigantic empire in the Pacific Ocean. Let me tell you something. Common sense dictates. The worst kind of fight you can have is when you've got people on both sides of you. There's an old saying, a gunfighter always sits with his back to the wall. So now the question is, how do you do this? Because the country that attacked us first is over here in the Pacific. The country that's committing untold atrocities and attacking and got our allies on the ropes is over here in the Atlantic. So what do? We decided to fight a two-theater war, but with the idea that we would put more emphasis on Europe to save Britain from falling. After all, remember, France had already surrendered. The Soviet Union was in trouble. Remember the turn of that, Hitler went back on that non-aggression pact, and that war wouldn't turn until Stalingrad. All right, World War II, when you speak about it, we see a lot of new weapons. we see the Jeep. That American icon of four-wheel drive. We see radar. And that's in all caps. Remember, radar is an acronym. We see aircraft carriers becoming prominent for the first time in military history. And we also see the atomic bomb. We also see more and more use of airplanes, of firebombing, of napalm, which we'll talk about later on when we get to Vietnam. Now, in terms of military strategy, here's America. Here's our GIs. By the way, the term GI stands for their gear. Whenever they had supplies shipped to them, or they got a new uniform, a new helmet, it was labeled as government issue, GI. And that term stuck, and that's why today our soldiers are often referred to as GIs.
We'll fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, American hero.
So now what happens is American soldiers are going to make a move on Europe. But to do that, first we're going to have to go pew 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 fight in North Africa. And here we get one of our most famous American military commanders, General George S. Patton. Patton will duke it out and battle German tank commander Erwin Rommel in North Africa.
Rommel, you magnificent bastard, I read your book!
Eventually what will happen is because we are able to be successful in North Africa, we then move on Sicily and Italy and get control of the Mediterranean. Okay, the big problem though is how do we get to mainland Europe? We don't do it like that. D-Day. To defeat the Nazis and the Italians, it was going to take an invasion of mainland Europe. So, Operation Overlord, as it was called, was the planned massive invasion of mainland Europe to defeat the Nazis, to get them out of the territories they had controlled, places like Belgium, places like France. And it was one of the greatest strokes of planning and spycraft ever. The D-Day invasion was supposed to have happened on multiple times. But the problem is if you're going to conduct an amphibious landing, you need air support. If you've ever gone on the ocean and tried to walk back in onto the beach when the waves are crashing at your back, you know how hard that can be. Now do it with a pack and a machine gun and bad guys are trying to kill you. The key we had to have was we had to have air support come in and take out the bad guys, take out enemy gun placements. But you can't do that, and then you can't drop in paratroopers unless you have clear weather. One of the groups of people who don't get enough credit for World War II, for D-Day, were our weathermen. The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944 was touch and go. It was dicey as to whether or not it would happen. German weather forecasters had said an invasion's not likely to happen at this time because it's too cloudy, the weather's too bad. The Allied meteorologists, however, knew there would be a break in the weather. Why was this an advantage? Hitler's best military commander, Erwin Rommel, was attending a birthday party and he was not ready to go for the D-Day invasion because he didn't think he needed to be. It's also some great spycraft. To prepare for the invasion, we couldn't let the enemy know, hey, we're going to go to Omaha Beach, to Utah Beach, we're going to go to Normandy, France. So we actually plotted out several fake invasion scenarios. American General George Patton had been disciplined. He had slapped a soldier in a hospital. So instead of allowing him to fight, they put Patton on a tour, going around to different places, and Nazi spies were following Patton everywhere. The idea was, here's Patton the rock and roll star. Wherever he is, that's where the invasion's going to come from. Grandmas and grandpas got jobs. People were given radios and scripts to broadcast fake radio messages to make it seem like there was an invasion. The Allies built cardboard planes and wooden tanks so that if German spy planes flew overhead, it would seem like a mass invasion was happening here. There's a great movie from the late 80s, early 90s called Weekend at Bernie's, where these guys end up going to their boss's house for the weekend, and they get in a lot of trouble. They think they're doomed because their boss drops dead. And they know the only way they can get out of this jam is they have to let people think that Bernie's alive while he's with them. So the movie's all about these guys taking this dead guy around, and they have all these wacky hijinks. Well, we have a real-life weekend at Bernie's. The British take an unnamed corpse, a John Doe, out of the morgue. They dress him up in an RAF uniform, Royal Air Force. They handcuff a briefcase with top secret battle plans on it. They take a submarine, they get right off the coast of Spain, they dump the body so that it washes up off the coast of Spain, which is controlled by the Axis, with these fake plans. Regardless, the Battle of D-Day was brutal. It was bloody. It was intense. But that invasion of mainland Europe turned the tide of the war in Europe. Alright, eventually, in June of 1945, Adolf Hitler killed himself in the bunker, which we now call VE Day, the Nazis surrender. The other thing that happens, though, is as we move through Europe, Dwight Eisenhower, who was the American commander in not just of Europe, but of the entire Allied forces, was given news about the death camps, about the Holocaust. One of the orders Eisenhower gave was that everything had to be documented like a crime scene. Cameras, motion picture cameras even. Evidence was gathered, just like police would. And that'll be important because after the war, one of the big results will be what are called the Nuremberg trials, where people who committed war crimes, not just the Nazis but also the Japanese, were put on trial for their crimes against humanity. And the world learned a lesson that you have to hold people accountable. You cannot just make the excuse that I was only following orders. Now, with the surrender of Germany, the focus of the war starts to change to Japan. The Pacific is a much, much more difficult task in that the U.S. fleet had been crippled. If you remember from our last lecture, we talked about the Pearl Harbor invasion. There was one silver lining. One, our 4 carriers were not there at Pearl Harbor. There was also an opportunity. The Japanese had called off the 3rd wave of attack on Pearl Harbor, which meant that U.S. ships that had been sunk, U.S. ships that had been badly damaged could be salvaged and repaired. Except, of course, for the most famous one, the USS Arizona, which to this day serves as a tomb for sailors at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. The turning point in the Pacific. Now, D-Day is the turning point in Europe. The turning point in the Pacific was the Battle of Midway. Midway became a battle of aircraft carriers. In fact, it's a naval battle where neither side actually saw the other ships. All carriers. And the United States proved victorious. That turned the momentum of the war. It allowed us to engage more and more in a strategy that we now call island hopping, where essentially, if these are islands controlled by the Japanese, islands that had strategic value, maybe there's airfields there, we'd capture those. Islands that weren't necessary for the war effort, we would try to bomb them, we would try to isolate them, but instead of invading them, we would just continue to the next one. As we move closer and closer to mainland Japan, it's important to understand that the death count, the casualties, the wounded became significantly worse. Go back to what you learned about the Code of Bushido in 9th grade, the way of the warrior, not surrendering. The fighting got bloodier. If you're sitting at home and you want something to do, there's a couple great movies you can watch. One is called Letters from Iwo Jima. Another is Flags of Our Fathers, about the struggle to defeat the Japanese at this island that's basically a volcanic rock. And the story of that, how that iconic flag was put up there by the Marines. And how the picture that you see isn't the flag. It was part 2. In fact, we have a former president who became a war hero there. At the Battle of Iwo Jima, there were 9 American pilots who were shot down by the Japanese. 8 of them were captured and beheaded by the Japanese. We know this because of documents from war crimes trials. The ninth one was shot down, got a little rubber life raft. He knew that if he was captured, he would be killed. He was paddling, and then he saw a submarine surface and thought, oh my gosh, I'll never see my wife. I'll never see home again. Except it was an American sub that rescued former President George Herbert Walker Bush. Bush 41. One of the most bloody battles in terms of casualties was Okinawa. Again, we're moving closer and closer to mainland Japan. Okinawa is an example of when the Japanese used what we now think of as kamikaze pilots, who would intentionally hurl their planes into American ships. In fact, by the end of the war, the Japanese were even using kamikaze torpedoes. Again, the death count was getting harder. Towards the end of the war, in 1945, America had a new president, Harry S. Truman. Truman was FDR's third different vice president. FDR hadn't kept him in the loop about a lot of things. It was mainly kind of like, hey, go on the circuit, give your speeches. And Truman was suddenly called to the White House. And he was told, the president's dead. Truman, his first thought was to try to comfort Eleanor Roosevelt and said, you know, Mrs. Roosevelt, I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do for you? And Eleanor Roosevelt, who was an extraordinary woman, looked him dead in the eye and said, Harry, I should be asking you that because you're the one who's in trouble now. So now here's Harry Truman having to get a crash course. Sorry, I should have a John Green reference, right? Or a Mongol Taj.
Unless, wait for it, you are the Mongols.
Well, he has to get a crash course in being president, learning about the wartime conferences and agreements, including this top secret project that we now call that's right, the Manhattan Project, the top secret project to build the atomic bomb. And Truman was told by his military advisors, look, the only way the Japanese will surrender is if you physically capture mainland Japan. Military estimates were that the death toll could be as much as 1 million Japanese civilians, could be upwards of 100,000 American casualties, or, Mr. President, you can take what's behind door number 2. We have 3 so-called gadgets. Atomic bombs. One was tested out in the desert of Los Alamos, New Mexico. We had 2 left. One a uranium bomb, the other using a new material called plutonium. In August of 1945, a plane named the Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb in world history on the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, because Japan had still not surrendered, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Nagasaki, sadly, wasn't even supposed to be the target. Pilots would be given secondary targets when they had bombing runs, and if you couldn't see because of weather, you would go to a different target. Because of weather, the original city that was targeted was not bombable, I guess you could say. So the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Days later, the Japanese had still not surrendered. Emperor Hirohito traveled by motorcade to a recording studio. He gave the famous speech. It was recorded on a record announcing the surrender of Japan. Go back again to that code of Bushido. The Japanese military decided to basically, quote, save the emperor from himself from disgrace. They plotted a coup d'etat to arrest the emperor and keep him from surrendering. They were actually laying in wait outside the emperor's palace for the motorcade to come back. In a very weird stroke of luck, a squadron of American bombers was flying to a target in northern Japan. The Japanese didn't know that. They also didn't know that we were out of atomic weapons. Air raid sirens went off. The emperor's motorcade was diverted to a bomb shelter, which delayed the arrest and detainment of the emperor. Hirohito had given the record to one of his aides, who was told, guard this, hide it, do something. It's amazing. The next time your mom or dad says, clean your room up, how many more people could have died if it weren't for a messy closet? This aide takes this recording, he goes into his bedroom, and he buries it in a messy closet. When the Japanese military commanders in charge of the coup d'etat storm the palace, they look everywhere, they can't find the recording. The coup falls apart, Hirohito's surrender message is played, And now we have what we call VJ, Victory in Japan Day. Now, one side note about the atomic bomb. The ship that delivered the Hiroshima bomb was called the USS Indianapolis.
You on the Indianapolis?
The Indianapolis was on such a secret mission they had to maintain radio silence. They delivered the Hiroshima bomb to the island of Tinian Delay. The captain of the Indianapolis said, "Look, I have to go to the Philippines. Can you give me a naval escort? I'd like a destroyer, the ships that were used to hunt submarines." He was told, "Nah, we don't have any available. But don't worry. All intelligence reports no Japanese submarines in the area." Now, during World War II, American captains were taught to sail in a zigzag pattern. And the idea was that would make it harder for the Japanese to hit you with torpedoes. We learned after the war that Japanese submarine commanders said that didn't matter. The captain of the Indianapolis, scared because he did not have a destroyer escort, and after he was told, "Look, there's no subs in the area," decided the heck with it. I'm going to hammer down and go straight. I'm going to get to the Philippines fast. A Japanese submarine was coming back from a routine patrol, and unfortunately they crossed past the Indianapolis. The Indianapolis sunk in the middle of the night.
Japanese submarine slammed 2 torpedoes into our side, Chief.
1,100 men went in the water. The Indianapolis crew was in the water for a couple days. Most of the men on board the Indianapolis died of dehydration. There's an old saying from a poem called Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. You can't drink salt water. They're in the sun, they're exposed, they're dehydrated. Men become desperate, they start to drink the salt water, they hallucinate. If you drink salt water, it will kill you. It causes your organs to shut down, but before you do, it will cause psychosis. There were stories of men having hallucinations and then turning on and killing their fellow sailors. There was another cause of death that people paid a lot more attention to. The Indianapolis became most famous for the sharks.
Didn't see the first shark for about half an hour. Tiger, 13-footer, you know that when you're in the water, Chief? You tell by looking from the dorsal to the tail. I don't know how many sharks, maybe 1,000. I don't know how many men, they average 6 an hour.
1,100 men went in the water. Less than 400 came out when they were rescued. And whether it was the way they died or what happened to them afterward, the sharks took the rest. Okay, back. Had to do a little bit of redecorating. Our poster fell down. So, the last thing we'll talk about when it comes to World War II today are the conferences. The term that you guys need to recognize is the Big Three. FDR, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin. Ironically, Stalin not so big. If you ever look at pictures of Joseph Stalin, he's a tiny guy. Big mustache, tiny guy. So, during the war, the Allies would meet at various conferences. Casablanca, in which FDR and Churchill met. Tehran, in Iran. But the two big ones, the two you have to know, are the Yalta Conference. This is the Big Three at their most important. Here they decide for what their plans will be, what Europe will look like after the war. They agree they're going to divide up Germany. You know the old saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Stalin wants assurances. He wants to know that he's not going to be invaded again. Germany will be divided up eventually into 4 different sectors. The Soviets, the British, the Americans, and the French. Stalin promises free elections in Eastern Europe. We know that's not going to happen. When we get to the Cold War, we'll talk about satellite nations. The USSR also promised that within 6 months of the defeat of Germany, that they would enter the war against Japan. That's going to become a factor, sadly, in one of the reasons why we dropped the atomic bomb. We wanted the Japanese to surrender before the Soviets got involved in the war. Finally, there was an agreement that a new world peacekeeping organization, what we now call the UN, should be created. It would later be created at the San Francisco Conference. In 1945, FDR had passed away. You have a new big three: Stalin, Churchill, and now you have Harry Truman. In Potsdam, Germany, Truman meets and they agree on the unconditional surrender of Japan. Terms would not be offered. Why do we care about these conferences? Because these two conferences, but especially Yalta, in many ways we can point to as, here's the beginning of our next unit, the Cold War. That's all the time we have for today. So cover your mouth when you cough, wash your hands, and log off and plug in your chromies, homies.